Hey everybody, welcome back to the Unstoppable podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and I've got a special guest today, Eva Beylin. She is the director of the Ethereum Foundation and also an investor at eGirl Capital. And I'm super excited to talk to her about both of those things. And we're going to be talking a little bit about anonymous culture, pseudo-anonymous culture as well, which is something that's been talked about a lot on crypto Twitter. And a lot of you have DM'd me questions about that. And so I'm really excited to have Eva today to share her thoughts on that whole community and that whole world. So welcome, Eva. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Diana. Excited to be here.
Awesome. So before we dive into the Ethereum Foundation and eGirl Capital, I'd love to hear a little bit about your background and how you got into crypto in the first place.
Yeah, so I went to business school in Canada and then went immediately into management consulting. This was about 4 to 5 years ago. Maybe longer. And I was working mostly on financial services. So working with payments companies, credit cards, banks, anything from helping with improving their legacy infrastructure to doing market analysis on payment behaviors. And at that time, my brother was working at Consensus, building out Bounty's network. So I started learning a lot more about Ethereum. And it got to a point where, I was running to the bathroom to see what was going on crypto Twitter instead of paying attention to my client. So I knew it was time to leave. So I defected into Ethereum and started working at Omise Go, which was a payments provider trying to build out a layer 2 for payments. And then eventually, moved to Bangkok to work there. And then, spent a year or so there, came back to North America, started helping out with a few other projects like the Ethereum Foundation, and eventually landed myself at the Graph.
Yeah, so it sounds like crypto Twitter was sort of your initial source of learning, and I'm sure it helped to have your brother in the space as well. But what was it about crypto that helped you? Like, when was it that it clicked for you, and how did you wrap your mind around it and make it all make sense?
Yeah, so having worked on payments companies and, projects related to how banks worked, I had realized pretty quickly that a lot of the problems that we see in society and, what Occupy Wall Street was about really don't have anything to do necessarily with the banks themselves. It has to do a lot with the technology, that isn't built in, a very open and decentralized manner. And so the technology itself allows for monopolization. So naturally, banks being the ones that are implementing that monopolistic behavior. And so upon realizing that and then seeing Ethereum as this, greenfield opportunity for anyone to be able to build on top of Ethereum, not needing to be permissioned by a specific, company or institution, it was so clear to me why we needed that, just like having worked on that similar industry. More personally, my parents were immigrants from Russia to Canada. They escaped, the communist regime. So any of these sort of authoritarian or, communist or, very strict types of decision-making or governance processes, really hit home to me. So to me, Ethereum and blockchains are much more about the philosophical movement of decentralizing decision-making power and empowering users to participate. So to me, that was, one of the most important things you could be working on in the world today.
Yeah, for sure. That is, I love hearing people who have like personal stories about how they got into it, because I think it means so much more to them and they like understand the root of what we're trying to build here. So diving into the Graph then, how did you transition from the Ethereum Foundation and Omise Go into the Graph? How did you get connected with the Graph?
Yeah, so I was spending some time between projects, one of them being the Ethereum Foundation, and I was really trying to find what was the next big challenge in Ethereum. I'm not by background an engineer, although I could code and understand technical writing. It was clear to me that there was other ways to add value that were quite critical for the time that Ethereum was at. So, Ethereum being several years old, hadn't quite achieved, the user mass adoption. And it was clear there were layers of the stack that just weren't completed. And then as, a management consultant that had worked very closely with data, being an analyst, the Graph's problem, seemed very clear to me that, we do need open data. We do need APIs that aren't necessarily gated by a company, similar to how a Bloomberg currently gates its terminal. And then furthermore, even within the dApp developer community, it was clear that what a subgraph does, a subgraph being the open API that the Graph indexes, is, significant for a developer, where you can can completely remove the back-end work that they need to do otherwise. So it was clear to me that, from the end user, from the analyst, the trader, the developer perspective, the graph was solving a really critical problem that hadn't been solved yet in Web3. And in my mind, these decentralized layers need to be built out before we can start building really cool end user applications.
Yeah, for sure. And let's just take a step back. For anybody who's not familiar with the graph, we did have Yaniv on to talk about the graph protocol before, but for anybody who missed that episode and isn't familiar, can you just break down for, a total beginner what the graph is and how the graph can help developers?
Yeah, so the short-winded story is the graph is the Google of blockchain. So we provide the back-end indexing of data that you often know of as Google, whereas Google also has the front-end search engine. More technically, all data that is on a blockchain, is what is often seen on a front-end application. But for a dApp or a developer to query that from the blockchain is actually quite challenging. And so the graph creates an obfuscated layer where, it's very generalized. Developers only have to query APIs called subgraphs. So there's a standardized way of querying those APIs. The subgraphs themselves are open source, meaning that when one developer creates a subgraph for a specific protocol like Uniswap, developers don't need to do that redundant work in-house or with their own proprietary code. So really enabling much more innovation and collaboration at the API level. And then lastly, actually decentralizing that component altogether. So typically in Web 2, you have, your own centralized server or database that you're running where you're indexing all your data. And by indexing, I mean, just simply organizing data in a way that you then want to present it to your UI. So going with the Uniswap example, all the Uniswap data, on uniswap.io is indexed by the graph. So maybe that's historical volumes, maybe that's pricing, whatever you might want. And so doing that in a decentralized way where you have a network of indexers or a network of node operators that are providing that service instead of your team or your project relying on one centralized server. And the problems it solves is, classic central points of failure. So maybe a server going down, maybe actual security risk of that server being hacked. And then even more broadly, developers don't have to then think about the back end at all. They don't need to be a back end developer to build a simple front-end application, and they can rely on a network of indexers. So, the network that launched in December 2020, so just about a year ago, has had zero downtime because you can always ensure that at least one indexer will be there to serve your queries.
That's awesome. So speaking of the graph network, I know there's this whole graph ecosystem. Can you explain all the different parts of it and maybe like how the Graph Foundation fits in with the graph protocol with the larger graph ecosystem?
Yeah, so I can start with the organizational side. So the Graph Protocol was launched by the Graph Foundation and the initial team Graph Protocol. Post-launch, these teams split into what is now known as Edge and Node, which is a core developer team, kind of coming from that initial team that launched the network. And then the Graph Foundation that's focused on everything related to the neutrality of the protocol or the ecosystem, focusing on growing the ecosystem. So that might be including grants, governance, maybe some project management of technical projects, including some of the protocol updates, doing a lot of the growth initiatives, whether it might be marketing or community, and really educating our ecosystem in Web3 about subgraphs and what you can do with them. Because we see subgraphs really as a catalyst, for accelerating Web3 development, where Web2 developers, might need to know a lot about Solidity or the blockchain, but maybe they don't need to then learn also how to index. And so the subgraph being a tool to actually accelerate development and learning within the dApp ecosystem. In terms of the way, everyone interacts, so we have, like I mentioned, Edge and Node as a core developer, and we have 3 other teams, that are core development contributors. So that would be Streaming Fast and Figment, who recently were awarded very large grants. And we've got a few other contributors that have received grants over the last several months, including Semiotic, and a few individual contributors who, could be considered core developers, essentially. And so everyone here is working together. We now have a fairly distributed community of contributors. And the foundation there really is to facilitate, a lot of this work, making sure that milestones are being met, aligning teams, really enabling the same functions of a DAO, but starting off a little slower and starting to also build out our own DAO design. So we're really focused on all of the governance and grants aspects of our ecosystem. Meanwhile, our core developers like Edge and Node are focused on the development work itself. Now, as part of the network, we also have several different stakeholders. So I mentioned indexers. These are the node operators of the network itself. We have the subgraph developers. So those are the actual engineers building these subgraphs that don't necessarily have to be the same project's developer. And then we have curators and delegators. So curators signal on subgraphs. They stake GRT on the subgraphs to indicate which of these APIs or projects is most high quality and should be prioritized. And then we have delegators who also, maybe want to contribute but don't want a super active role, and so they delegate their GRT to indexers. So both of these roles, curator and delegator, are non-technical. You don't even need to be an engineer or really understand, code as much as understanding, okay, these projects that are built by these developers are high quality, and we should make sure our ecosystem is prioritizing them.
Got it. I want to hone in on a couple of those things. The first one being, I'd love to hear when the Graph Foundation started to be built out, it was built out as sort of like an extension of the Graph protocol or just a part of this larger Graph ecosystem. And then over time, you've been thinking more about decentralizing it and essentially turning it into a DAO. I'd love to hear about that process of how do you turn something that's initially centralized into, something that's decentralized, and then how your team has been thinking through all of the aspects of creating a DAO, governance, scaling, all of the big questions that people are thinking about.
Yeah, so the Graph Foundation is sort of the steward in the ecosystem. So we oversee currently the community treasury that is also overseen by the Graph Council. So the foundation was nominated by the Graph Council to oversee some of these community initiatives while we were progressively decentralizing. And I'd say that's the key word. So when we launched the network, we were taking the approach of progressively decentralizing our ecosystem. Now we're there. We've got quite a few different contributors. We've got a lot of different expertise entering the space, so there isn't one single organization leading the charge, so to speak. The Graph Foundation itself, we are here to serve, largely a bootstrapping function where, in the first 6 months, we were really there to support indexers, funding a lot of indexer tooling, overseeing various projects that would improve perhaps stake decentralization, or helping indexers just grow their knowledge to be able to contribute, and continuing to do so with much more focus now on DevX. What do subgraph developers need, dApp developers need? How do we get more of them integrated? And also largely our community. So we're looking to launch an advocacy program soon, and get more individuals across the globe involved in non-technical and technical ways. In terms of your second question, so migrating to a DAO, I used to work with the Moloch DAO team, have been in the space for quite some time. And things we've realized is, it's very easy to launch a DAO and kind of expect certain human behaviors to come out of it. Whereas what we realized we're doing is kind of taking the human aspect first. So we have quite a few grantees, over 100 grantees at the moment. We have several domain experts. So these are individuals that help us interview, help us conduct due diligence on grants. We also release every quarter our announcement of grants, and also asking for more input. So continuing to maintain a very open process, while also being under the purview of the Graph Council. So the Graph Council is 10 individuals that represent 5 stakeholder groups in our ecosystem. And so emulating a DAO in this sense has been our first priority. And now what we're looking to do is realize, how do we scale this in a way that removes us perhaps as a facilitator or organizer, and enables greater trust in our ecosystem so our grantees, our network participants can get more involved. We're doing a lot of research. So we were recently cited in Nathan Schneider's paper, where he reflected on some of the ways governance has worked and not worked. And one reflection he had is, a council enables a lot more trust in the kinds of decisions that you're making, enables greater representation, whereas token-based systems aren't necessarily, as safe long-term because it could be, ridden by plutocracy or plutocratic behavior. And so we're taking our time, in figuring out what is the ideal mechanism for our ecosystem given its current maturity and participation.
Yeah, and can you explain more how the council model works? I think the main criticism I've heard being, that it reflects it. It looks a lot more similar to a centralized model where you have sort of like a few people, or however big your council is in charge of all the decision making. Is it, so I guess like, how do we solve the issue of this just turning into a traditional organization, a corporation as we know it today? Is it that you have, like term limits essentially, or like regular voting for, who people want to see in the council and out, or like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, so our council has always been sort of a first step. Even our announcement on the council and its decision-making process was recognizing that the future likely holds, a much more decentralized process. Maybe it's nested multi-sigs or nested DAOs, but largely, following a similar structure of representing the various groups in our ecosystem. So the council is made up of 5 groups with 2 representatives per group. And those groups are delegators, indexers, dApp developers, research and security folks, as well as the initial team. The initial team representing a core development group. So there's definitely opportunity to start expanding this as our ecosystems expand themselves. As I mentioned, we now have welcomed several other core developers to our community that likely want to get more involved. For the time being, we are fairly transparent about all the activities of the council. Chatham House rules are followed with our biweekly meetings that are also posted to the forums. Every single graph improvement proposal, or what we call GIPs, are passed in the forum and also proceed with a snapshot vote prior to actually being voted by the council. So the community has immense time to get involved and can even be the ones to recommend specific GIPs in the forum or by joining indexer office hours or a core dev call. So all of these are open processes. And then the council will typically follow the result of the snapshot vote or seek greater due diligence if that's what's needed. So I agree with you. I think there's a lot of room for us to grow into a more decentralized process. But for now, this has been sort of our method of bootstrapping our governance so we can learn from our community, what fits best rather than just applying a generalized solution.
Yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. Another element you mentioned earlier that the Graph Foundation is really in charge of is education. And I was wondering with, educating devs who are already, very smart group of people, I think it still can be confusing to understand the graphs, subgraphs, all of these things. So what methods have you found to be most effective when it comes to educating, devs or the public or whoever?
Yeah, so the cool thing about subgraphs is they're written in TypeScript, which is not that far off from JavaScript. So one angle we've taken is if you are completely new to blockchain, nothing about Web3, maybe try getting into crypto through the graph. Because maybe, it might be a little easier for you to learn TypeScript, maybe take a look at a pre-existing schema for a subgraph and then recreate or maybe fork one. And by doing so, they can also learn about the protocol. So that's one path we've taken, especially with our hackathons and grantees, where a lot of the grantees, have interest in building a subgraph, maybe have done it once, but don't have enough confidence or ability to actually make it their full-time job. And so we've given them grants to build out subgraphs for different teams. So like I mentioned, a lot of the subgraphs built aren't even built by the project itself. It's maybe a project really wants one, doesn't have the capacity, so they come to us to help them find a grantee to build it out. So that's one way we've kind of been growing our sphere of potential subgraph developers. Another is getting really involved in the university space. So we were speaking initially with a team in Milan that was driving this sort of blockchain open data module. We were speaking with someone at UBC, University of British Columbia, and looking now to expand even to others in Europe. But basically bringing home this idea that subgraphs themselves in nature aren't very different from an API that you might have used in Web 2, but they open up this whole world of, Web 3 and crypto. And so if we can actually get into the students, teaching them about these tools, Ethereum, what is the EVM, what is a seed phrase, how do you, even think about on-chain data early, then they can start building dApps, much sooner, maybe even leave university, who knows. But those have been our avenues so far. And now we're starting to expand much more into this sort of freelance or free-for-all education. So a lot of these online courses, getting involved maybe even in in-person workshops as the world opens up, really trying to figure out how do we achieve this next 1 million developers in Web3.
Yeah. And then the last thing I wanted to get your thoughts on is this element of community. You've brought it up many times, and the graph has a super strong community. And that's a question that a lot of new projects are facing, is how do we build this strong community? Web3 is built, so heavily on community and vibes. And so I'd love to hear like some of your thoughts on what the graph has done right in terms of building this like super strong community.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it was a multi-year process. So first off, we started with a hosted service, not a decentralized network. And the goal there was to achieve product market fit. So we were getting user feedback from developers for several years before the network actually launched. And that allowed, developers to actually become much more used to the technology itself, provide feedback, maybe even have, a relationship with the development team. So, to inform feature development. So that was number one. Number two, I'd say, we really thought about what is the education path before we launched the network that has to occur for people to get involved. So we had an incentivized testnet that ran about 6 months. This was for node operators to understand what is the graph, how do you run a graph node, what are the mechanics that you have to think about, economics, et cetera. And we also ran similarly an incentivized curator program. And this was targeted to non-technical people who maybe had never even coded before, but you could learn about a subgraph. So you could actually learn how to develop a subgraph, maybe how to assess high quality. And if you were not interested in coding, you could maybe just write about it. What are the benefits of open data? Maybe creating educational materials for others to get involved. So both of these programs we ran for about 6 months. It allowed us to build a community that was quite loyal and also interested. They were, not afraid to ask stupid questions. They got to know us and the rest of our community and have now stuck through because they recognize what we're building is really valuable and they can contribute. Because I'd say the largest thing, that separates our protocol from others is that it doesn't matter how technical you are. There's at least one role that you could align yourself to. And that makes it really open for then anyone to join rather than someone who might be only a DevOps engineer.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So looking ahead to the future, where do you hope to see the Graph Foundation and the larger Graph ecosystem in, let's say 3 to 5 years? I mean,
we always say this, the Graph is indexing all the world's data. Taking that one step back, we need to get all the world's data on Web3. So really making sure that we're helping dApps get that adoption, whether it's a DEX, whether it's, a writing app. We're trying to become much more strategic with either how can a subgraph play a more significant role or how can we as the graph play a more significant role in dApp adoption. Also multi-blockchain. So currently we support over 19 EVM-based chains on the hosted service and Ethereum. And we'll be migrating all of those to the network, as well as supporting other chains like Solana, Near, Polkadot. Really anything that has a blockchain should be indexed by the graph or even has some kind of network. So also looking at specialty networks like Helium, Akash, really anything that has some kind of verifiability on a chain. And at that point, we'll start looking at how do we, improve the infrastructure to actually meet everyone's goals, because it's clear Web3 isn't going anywhere. Even just seeing Ethereum's NFT growth in the last 6 months, is indicative of where we're headed. So the graph really is focused on improving indexing performance, making sure all the subgraph features that developers want are built out. And once all that tooling and infrastructure is ready, then we can start actually helping build out really cool dApps on Web3. So one of the reasons I joined the graph, was eventually to build out a search engine. So it'd be great if, one day we can have that built out. Another place, we'd like to see subgraphs used more in is a lot more of this cross-chain data. So one trend we've seen is a lot more wrapped Bitcoin or Bitcoin on DeFi use cases seeing a lot more adoption, which is indicative of just greater interest of interoperability or maybe bringing other chains onto Ethereum. So as we start to support more chains, I think we'll see a lot more of that play out.
Yeah, I would love to see a decentralized search engine like Google on Web3. And I mean, the graph is for sure the best position to build that out. So I can't wait to see that. All right, cool. So I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about eGirl Capital. So I think everybody's heard of eGirl Capital. You guys have been around since I think 2019, but a lot of people are confused about what eGirl Capital actually is. I think they see a bunch of, a team of anons running this like what seems to be a venture capital fund of sorts. So tell us a little bit more about what eGirl Capital is and like how it was originally formed.
Yeah, so it's definitely been a mystery, even as we've been building it out. I would say we didn't realize what it would become. But eGirl Capital first started out as a few friends just, shooting the shit in a Telegram channel, trading, information, data, sharing whatever it was. And we realized pretty quickly that we had a really unique set of people in the group. So eGirl Capital is 14 people. Some of them are advisors, some of them are more, contributing members. But the goal was, how do we bring our diversity and actually maybe, impact the venture capital industry in a way that would be useful to projects. So, myself, I'm not by trade a VC. Many of our members are either engineers or work full-time on other projects. Some of them are leading projects. And so we have this unique position where we're also builders and users and ecosystem contributors, and also want to actually participate as a capital allocator. So we, got our shit together, earlier this year, I would say, and have been investing in some really critical projects. Our thesis is largely to support, really critical infrastructure or primitives in the space that we see being really useful in the future. So some of our investments have focused around layer 2, maybe some DeFi primitives. And so we're looking to support any project we think is going to be valuable and sustainable.
Then do you operate as a fully decentralized organization? Like when I guess what does the process look like if somebody comes through and they're like, hey, I just heard about this new project, I think we should invest, and then what happens next?
Yeah, we definitely operate in a decentralized fashion in that we have to have a certain number of members agree to the deal or want to participate in the deal itself. So that's one unique element of our fund, is that not everyone is participating in every deal. But, for us to actually consider an eGirl investment and want to support the project itself, there has to be sufficient buy-in. So most of this activity is currently occurring off-chain, although we have explored maybe some kind of on-chain decentralized tooling like a DAO. But, to your point, there is a lot of sort of coordination work that occurs when you have this many people. So, we are fairly careful with the investments we make, and we don't really make that decision unless there's enough alignment.
That makes sense. And another question I had for you is around this anonymous or pseudo-anonymous culture. All of the investors, all 14 of you, are either completely anonymous or pseudo-anonymous online. And can you speak a little bit to what went behind that decision? And also for people listening who maybe aren't familiar, are new to crypto, or aren't familiar with this anonymous culture, can you try to explain what the draw is behind being anonymous online?
Totally. So just to clarify, I'm not a non or pseudonon, although I have an image of myself that is of an anime girl. But there are I think it's still three doxed members of the 14. So to your point, 11 are pseudonon. And pseudonon being that, online or in our communities, no one knows what their birth name is, but perhaps somewhere in the world they, have disclosed that. So there are a few eGirl members that I've met, although most of them I have not, nor do I necessarily know their birth names. But the cool thing to me about, specifically crypto and crypto and pseudonymity interacting is that crypto enables us to actually use different usernames, essentially, our wallets on different applications. So the ease of creating a new identity has never been simpler, and not in the Sybil attack context, but in the idea of, enabling yourself to have different characters. So there's, this idea that you can only have one job or you can only be one person, but what if you could be many different people? And what if you could have many different jobs and all of that together sustained your income? And maybe one of your personas is an indexer on the graph, and maybe another one of your personas is a liquidity provider for a DEX, and a third persona is an NFT artist. And, the reason you want to keep these separate is perhaps they're different brands, perhaps for accounting purposes, or for whatever reason. But the cool thing that Web3 enables is for us to have that kind of composability of our identities across applications. So to me, that was really fascinating, just meeting, the other eGirls, in that they were, creating reputations around this profile. And just because we couldn't assert a specific KYC or birth name to them doesn't mean that reputation didn't exist. Like you mentioned, most of the people, had either been around since 2019 or earlier in crypto. So they've been working hard on building out their own communities, their own expertise, and they're just now a member of eGirl. So often when people ask me, how do you trust them? This is crazy. And I'm like, well, people are always building out their reputations. And, in theory, someone could rug pull you if they were pseudonym. But it's actually really challenging to build up a reputation, even to have a following on Twitter or to have people trust you and offer to bring you into their project, into their trusted community, takes a while. And so nobody in eGirl is here to, disrupt that or create any problems. They simply are identifying with their personality that they have that, today.
Yeah. And one thing I've been thinking about a lot with like anon or pseudo anon culture in crypto is this question around, how do we like form human connections with people who are anonymous online? Like, how do we form a connection with, somebody who's a cat or a penguin online, and that's all we know about them is that one thing? And if we're working in the context of a DAO, for instance, which a lot of people are involved in now, and somebody feels like overworked, burnt out, wants to take a step back, how can we show them that sort of empathy if we've never connected with them on a human level, like don't know their names, don't know anything about them because they choose to be anonymous?
That's a really good question. I think that identity ends up coming down to behavior more than a specific label. And so, whether that's in a Discord or a Telegram group or watching on-chain behavior, so maybe they're voting or past DeFi activity, you can actually develop that identity and that personality very quickly. In talking about empathy, I feel like I know eGirl as much as any person I've met in person because I'm still able to have, really real conversations. We often do voice chats, all of the things that you do as a human member of a team, you can still do. You just don't necessarily know their birth name or what their actual, face looks like. But that doesn't necessarily stop you from also developing all those other behaviors and relationships that you'd have with them otherwise. So I think that we almost need to change our tune a little bit to what does it mean to have identity? Does identity literally mean the way I was born, or is it how do I identify today and what are my behaviors associated with that identity? One thing I'm personally really excited about is the VTuber movement, where you can recreate your image, with maybe an anime character or using different kinds of AI, and I can behave as a different person, and that's pretty cool in the context of having different jobs. So a lot of people don't explore different jobs because they're worried about conflating those brands or that work. But imagine if, Diana, you could have a different version of Diana that, was a gamer and you were Twitch streaming all the time. And that was your new personality. And people could maybe still get to know you by talking to you in the chat. But they know you as that Diana, not this Diana.
Yeah, it's a little dystopian to think about. And I think like I haven't really formed my own opinions around is this, is this good or bad? And I'm sure there's no good or bad. There's good and bad things to everything. But I have thought about is it good for us to sort of decompose our identity into these different parts? Or should we embrace all parts of who we are in all settings? I'm not really sure.
That's a good point. Why aren't we all versions of ourselves, in the one form? That's fair criticism. The experimentalist in me is excited about the idea of compartmentalizing because often we're, in our own conflicts all the time, right? Do I want to do this? Oh, I'm not sure how this will be perceived by my boss, or I'm not sure if this aligns with these goals. But, there's kind of this world of opportunity now where we can, if we have the time, capacity, and resources, assert different goals that maybe are completely unrelated, but might actually be better off if they remained unrelated. And so now we can do that. And with ENS names, being connected to wallets, we create this whole world where maybe even usernames are associated with that work and that identity in a different way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, cool. Well, I like to conclude every podcast segment with episode with a segment I call Explain Your Tweet. This is where I go through your Twitter and I pull out some interesting or cryptic tweets and I give you a chance to explain them. So your Twitter is just full of these interesting and cryptic tweets. But I try to pull out a few good ones that I think you can really, explain to people what you're saying there. So the first one I've got is from September 24th, 2021. You tweeted, "DAOs are the anti-government government." What do you mean?
Yeah, this is a great one. So, along our process of figuring out how to construct a DAO, what's the best DAO for our ecosystem, I realized that a lot of what the foundation or a DAO often does is similar to what we tell a government to do. So maybe it's public goods funding, keeping people secure, maybe being the lender of last resort, whatever it might be. But the fundamental difference is that a government, we tell them not to have any incentives, right? They're not allowed to invest in stocks. And we create all these different rule sets around them. And that to me doesn't really make sense because we know that these folks have self-interest. We see insider trading constantly. So the problem here isn't that a government exists or maybe even the mandate. It's how we're incentivizing and how we're organizing that government. And so in my mind, a DAO actually solves a lot of this because a DAO, doesn't enforce a single company or a single contributor. In fact, the goal of the DAO is to have as many diverse contributors with different self-interests as possible, but to come to terms with aligning on whatever that mandate may be. So I think, a DAO, often operates like a government in that it's providing the same services, but is kind of like the anti-government, the anti-centralized monopoly that's making decisions for its citizens. It's really how do we actually as citizens be participating in that governance to provide public goods funding?
Yeah. Very interesting thought. Okay, so the next tweet I've got is from October 2nd, 2021. You said, Ethereum is a social network. We just need to expose its interfaces. What do you mean by that?
So I've been thinking a lot about what Vitalik said. I believe it was at ECC. He was trying to encourage more people to build social applications. So you have Aave now trying to build a Twitter. And it occurred to me that, what is a social network? Like, what are we trying to build when we say that? And often it's just the rails of communication. And what we have today is, Ethereum, where you have an address and often an ENS associated with it. And that ENS then is essentially a profile. And so if we think about it that way, a wallet is a profile, similar to a MySpace or a Facebook profile. And then Ethereum is the actual social network, and the way we're communicating or behaving is maybe through our transactions. Maybe we're even sending signed messages as people do today. And so maybe instead of thinking of social as, a dApp, we could be thinking of, Ethereum as social, and we're just trying to build the right way to communicate on that network. So what is the best way we want to start communicating with each other between our ENS or our wallet addresses that might be most composable for other dApps? So I think it's still a work in progress thought, but my point being Ethereum is the social network. We're building on top of it.
Yeah, for sure. And then this last tweet I've got is from October 3rd, 2021. You said, it's hard to quantify the impact NFTs have on mental health and dopamine. Sometimes I'll be doom scrolling or having a bad day and a glorious art appears, changing the mood instantly. Art has healing powers and crypto art is more than just about the culture, market, or tech. And I really like this one because I feel like it goes back to like the core of what art is, which has somehow been forgotten, I think, like with NFT art. But like would love to hear just your thoughts behind that tweet too.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we've kind of absorbed NFTs in this like capitalist narrative, which to be fair exists. And yes, NFTs are providing artists this new way of monetizing. But to me, like you're saying, like digital art and art in itself just has this whole other significance. And so literally sometimes I'll be on Twitter and I'll be just like trash about crypto. And you see a piece of art and it really doesn't matter, what price it was sold for, what platform, just its existence can actually change our lives. And with Ethereum and Web3 kind of normalizing NFTs, what we're really doing is normalizing galleries and do-it-yourself galleries. And instead of having to literally go to a gallery and pay for a ticket and do this whole process, we can actually have these micro galleries on our feeds, whether it's Twitter, whether it's OpenSea or SuperRare, but normalizing this ability for art to impact our lives in ways that we hadn't before.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Eva, for taking the time to come on today. Before you go, just tell people where they can find you if they want to connect with you personally, and then also where people can go to learn more about the graph and to connect with eGirl.
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at Eva Beylin. That would be the best place to connect. To learn more about the graph, I suggest heading to thegraph.com or thegraph.com/Discord. We have so many people in our community willing to help you regardless of your question. And to learn more about eGirl, I also suggest following us on Twitter. We have a pretty robust blog called eGirl Insights that releases stuff weekly or monthly.
I have to shout out the blog. I've read like all of your articles and there's so much alpha in those articles. Like I can't believe this is like free content, but it's amazing. So everybody go check it out.
Love to hear that you're a reader.
Yeah, thanks again so much, Eva. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And we'll be back again soon with another episode of the Unstoppable podcast.
Thank you.